All right, hello. I'm Stephen
Hello.
West. Welcome to the After Show, the Partially Examined Life podcast. Today we're talking about Gadamer. I'd like to apologize for the connection issues for anybody that experienced that. Uh, uh, I'd like to also apologize for my relegated ability to speak today. I haven't slept in 24 hours. I'm actually broadcasting from a hotel room. But like the greatest warriors that have ever lived on planet Earth, when you're met with adversity, you don't give up. You keep trudging forward. And that's what we've done here today. That's what makes us the best after show in all of iTunes. I have many friends with me today. Last couple times, only been 2 or 3. This time, it's different. My, how the tables have turned. I'd like to welcome a Moog.
Yes.
That's his voice. So whenever you hear that intelligent person speaking, you'll know that that's a Moog.
You're
Next on the
very
docket,
kind, Stephen.
I'm just honest. Next on the docket is my good friend Eric. Eric, say something.
Hey.
That's good. That's good enough for me. Whenever you hear you're going to know it's Eric. Next on the docket is going to be Everett, one of my favorite cities in Washington. How are you?
Just fine. Hello.
Hello.
Lindsay Myers in the house.
Mark is not worthy of being in this conversation. Michael, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, that's his voice. London accent. Very beautiful voice. You'll know that that's Michael. Peter.
Hello.
There you go. Washington, D.C., home of Barack Obama. And, of course, Rashid, our good friend. He doesn't have his microphone turned on right now, but something tells me if you hear something really intelligent, you can assume that it's Rashid, and I would be completely remiss if I didn't announce the presence of the celebrity himself, the man, the myth, the legend, Seth Paskin. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic, Stephen. Thank you.
Can I say I'm honored to have a pillar of the philosophical world in my presence, as always. I feel privileged to just be in a close proximity to you. Now, on to more important things. Gadamer, the reason we're all here today, right? Gadamer is... Maybe I should just start the conversation by saying something a little bit shorter than I did last week. Maybe I should just give you a metaphor that I like to use to think about the way that he looks at hermeneutics. Although it's going to be an incredible butchery of his work, and he says it much more eloquently than I do. I just want you guys to start out the conversation by attacking this metaphor that I have. The way I like to think of hermeneutics is that it's almost like if we were standing on a boat and we were trying to go spearfishing and attack a fish that's inside of the water. Not only is the boat moving, not only is the fish moving, but we need to sort of understand our own prejudices and biases that are present just because we have eyes and there's a certain condition that we're in when we're up on this boat moving, and we need to spear not where the fish actually looks like it is in the water, but where we know it is based on taking into account all of those prejudices and biases that we have. What do you guys think about that?
That's
Everything's
not too
moving.
bad, actually.
Oh, man. Glowing endorsement.
Well, I mean, it depends on how you interpret how I interpret this particular metaphor, but I think preconceptions come into it. Where I would have to sort of disagree with the way you put it is the suggestion that you can somehow interrogate them, right? Like there's this whole Heideggerian thing that the preconceptions that we have can be thought of as some kind of mode of being, and therefore they work on this kind of deeper ontological level rather than at this kind of phenomenal level where you can take and play with them, right? In some sense, that's the major criticism I'd have of the metaphor.
Well, to fuse Heidegger's concern with technology, I didn't completely hear what you said, so the metaphor had several pieces chopped out of it, which is as an apt metaphor for hermeneutics in communication.
I was actually unplugging my internet as I said it to create that effect.
Could you repeat it?
Sorry, me or Stephen?
I think he's asking.
The metaphor.
Right. So, Stephen.
Okay, so the way I like to think about it is like we're standing on top of a ship or a boat. Probably a boat if we're spearfishing, not a ship. It's going to be a very long spear. Just imagine you're standing in a canoe. It's moving downstream. The boat is moving. You are moving on the boat. You are spearfishing, and you are trying to stab a fish that is inside of the water. The fish is also moving. It's very slippery. And the fish is also not exactly where it looks like it is inside of the water. The water itself distorts the perception of where the fish is And so hermeneutics can kind of be seen as the task of understanding and taking into account all the calculations you have to do to be able to hit the fish, to aim at the water where the fish actually is, as opposed to where the fish appears to be.
Okay, thank you.
At least hermeneutics in the...
Maybe the fish is disturbing. I mean, I don't know the kind of teleological spin you've put into it in terms of there being a fish there that you've got to catch, or maybe because I mean there is the notion that a text has a singular meaning is perhaps one of the themes that seem to come up in the podcast, right? In terms of, so in that sense it's problematic. The slipperiness I think is a good thing to catch, but I think the notion of the fish. To borrow a metaphor from Portal, the fish is alive, right? You might not have this, or I don't think Gadamer thinks that there exists this one fish that you've got to catch. At least that's where I find the problem.
If I may say so, that was what I liked about the metaphor, that at the end there is, whether you want to call it intersubjective or objective, the whole thing doesn't just collapse into an endless encircling of yourself, that there is actually something to chase, and that is the meaning of the text. It isn't the intentionality of the author or the content of the author's mind, but there is something in the text to grab hold of, and insofar as the metaphor demonstrates that was the aspect of it which I liked, because I think if you do put this rather subjective spin on things, where you just say, oh no, you're aiming for the fish, but the fish isn't there, then you're, I think, perhaps potentially misleading people into thinking that Gadamer doesn't think there's any meaning at all in things.
I suppose there's a distinction about what the fish means rather than what the fish... I mean, I was talking about more of the fish as the sort of the traditional approach of reading a text, insofar as there is a single hegemonic meaning, and that fish represents that single hegemonic meaning. You seem to be saying something slightly different.
Yes. I mean, I would talk about the meaning in the Gadamerian sense, if that's the correct.
I see. That makes a lot of sense.
The of the metaphor appeals to me because you take into account the distortions of the water. So I do not have an immediate empirical observation of where the fish is. I can't rely on this immediate input of my senses, but the truth is out there. To X-file it a bit. So maybe I mean, it's not so much concerned with pinning down the one particular meaning, but there is this robust sense, and I don't know if you call it realism, but truth is at work in that moment. You know, I am on the ocean where such fishes have been before, and I'm here with the equipment, and I have observation of something, although I know my eyes are not telling me directly, you know, where it is in Cartesian space. But the fish is there.
But what exactly is meant by the fish, though? Sorry, what exactly do both of you mean by the fish?
If I may just interject briefly, I'm not convinced that we're talking about Gadamer anymore.
Ah.
How long has it been? 5 minutes?
Yeah, well, I mean, the scaliness of the metaphor, I think, is particularly...
The scaliness? Did you just do
It feels a bit scholastic, the discussion now, about whether the metaphor should have scales or not, or whether the...
or whether it should be a rescue, not a hunt. You know, rescuing a friend might be...
Very floundering.
Well, I think I think there's a lacking of genuine, charitable. It's lacking of charity to endlessly chase the details of a metaphor.
So I think it may be time to try to either modify or move off if the point is the strength of the metaphor is that it talks about a distortion in perception, which equivocates in the Gadamerian interpretive framework to a set of preconceptions that we each bring to an interpretation or an exercise in interpretation. So you can imagine the water is kind of like our worldview, and it dictates, in some sense, how we see things if we take it uncritically, if we don't question it. And what you're trying to do is question the assumption of the distortion that you're getting from your worldview, which is in this case the water, in order to try and not negate it or abandon it, but just to, in a sense, kind of counteract it or adjust for it in the interpretive process. And I think that's about as deep as it's worth going on the fish metaphor for right now, because on the back end of that is the fact that the text has its own historical context in which it was created, and you have to sort of take that into account as well. And so we would need to kind of have a more complex metaphor to kind of capture both sides of that. And that's what Gadamer's saying, is you have to acknowledge your historical setting and the historical setting of the text that you're approaching to do true hermeneutic interpretation.
Well, whether we're talking about fishing or any activity, I'm thinking of the three, for lack of a better term, Heideggerian terms of being, doing, having. Being a fisherman, there's a certain techne in fishing or any activity, and then there's something that you're after. But it seems that the being is just sort of, much richer than the fact that, great, I caught a fish, because the world keeps going on. I mean, it seems a very Western, like we're trying to turn this into, there's a prize to be won, which is very far from the domain of being, and getting too hung up with, deconstructing light waves and waves, with our techne to, be a better fisherman. I think it's, I don't know. I just sort of throw that out there as being, doing, having is the broader domain of engagement and activity in hermeneutics.
I wondered about the status of subject and object, though. Is this in this when we talk about Heidegger here, right? But I mean, one of the references that you made in the podcast was to this particular traditional view that you set Gadamer against. I wonder if someone could speak to that, perhaps, because I wasn't so clear on what that was.
Sounds like Seth.
Yeah, it sounds like a Seth question. So, to be honest, I have not listened to the episode again, so I only have the conversation in memory from when we did it. So, feel free to correct me, since we just recorded on Recur and I may be conflating. So, I think the traditional or standard approach was construed by us, and it's construed by Gadamer as saying, there is a meaning in a text has a meaning, a canonical meaning, and you can use the word truth if you want, to some extent, at least as applied to whether you get the meaning correct or whether you're getting the correct meaning. And the idea is that this truth is somehow ahistorical. So, such and such a book, Madame Bovary is a story about a woman who's, is in a restrictive social order and has a disconnected social experience with such and such. And the idea is, okay, when you read Madame Bovary, you're supposed to get that meaning, or if you interpret Madame Bovary, you're supposed to get that meaning. And anybody interpreting in any era, since it was published, would be interpreting and getting that same meaning. And what Gadamer's trying to do is enrich the concept of interpretation to say, look, there's no such thing as a canonical meaning. There's a meaning that the text itself has meanings that are generated out of its production, so the author's intent, the influences of other contemporary texts, and so on, the historical setting. And then when you read it, you are going to bring your own set of assumptions to the text. And what this means is every individual and every generation, every geographical difference of people who come from different social, ethnic experiences are going to interpret differently, and so the activity of interpreting the text is simultaneously needing to acknowledge that and take that into account, but also it's a continuous ongoing activity, which will yield multiple meanings out of the text. And there's no such thing necessarily as a canonical kind of meaning in the text.
So each reading, as it were, is kind of this like historically contingent interaction between the reader and the text.
Yeah, I think that's what he's saying.
And that goes against the kind of Kantian and neo-Kantian idealism that's immediately preceding Gadamer and Heidegger. But it poses a challenge for people raised in the kind of Anglo-American literary tradition, which is that of the new criticism or formalism, in which you are simply to address the formal structures and the significations of the words on the page. You know, T.S. Eliot compared it to, imagine you're doing a forensic, you're doing an autopsy, and you're at various points you throw in different body parts into the corpse. It's like you've really, you know, messed up the thing that you're really just supposed to be taking as it is. And this is, in some sense, you know, someone from a literary background and aware of that. That is the challenge. Just getting into that German historicist sphere, and then the attempt of Gadamer and Heidegger to overcome that sphere, which is just very different from the way the study of literature has been, you know, since just before World War II in U.S. and Great Britain.
It's interesting you say that, because Seth placed a lot of emphasis on historical contingency. Could you kind of elaborate on what you mean by transcending historicity? And I mean, I have an inkling of what you mean with regards to the post-Hegelianism of a lot of these people, but you perhaps are going.
Yeah. So again, from a new critical, basically 1930s, 1940s way of reading, there is no moment other than the encounter with the words on the page. Doesn't matter if that happened in 1812 or it happens in 1989 or 2013. The procedure is to attend to the formal structure of the words on the page. But if we go back to in some of the other parts of Truth and Method that you didn't look at, he talks about a kind of romantic hermeneutics where either you relive in yourself at that moment the same creative impulse that the writer had. There's a hope that you can have that instant resonance, to be in the exact same state that the creator was whenever. That's something that he doesn't want to engage with, something he has to talk against or get beyond. A more naive hermeneutics that had been in the kind of German-speaking world for a while. I think, yeah. So those weren't parts of the Truth and Method that weren't talked about. I think I'm breaking one of the rules at this point.
Name dropping, or is that?
Yeah, name dropping and talking about what's on the reading list.
That was the after show. Don't worry about those rules.
All right.
There are no rules.
Well, it reminds me of a famous author, so I won't name drop, who was asked, Senor
Hemingway?
Borges. Was asked, what
name dropping.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say Senor.
It's not name dropping. He's got the Borges letters behind him on his shelf. He's pointing
being
to
paid
an
off by the Borges lobby.
Pointing.
I met Borges in college, and I have a little tiny connection there, but it doesn't matter. And then the famous question is, Senor Borges, when you wrote XYZ, what did you mean? And his answer was, well, when I wrote it, God and I knew what it meant. Now only God knows. And, it gets you even back to some point of, does the author even really know? I mean, after it leaves his pen. I mean, so this whole notion of that there is some canonical meaning that even the author knew. Mm-hmm. That's, I guess, the fish we're talking about.
Well, there's two senses in which an author may or could possibly know about the meaning of his work. He could know what he intended it to mean, and he could know what it actually meant. If we take some broadly Kantian assumptions, and it seems like the author knows neither of those things. He might kind of know what he intended it to mean if he's particularly self-aware in a moment in time, let's take you could take for example a person who is accidentally racist. That they have a sentence, they say something, it happens to be a racist sentence because they don't have control over how it's interpreted by others, and it's a fair interpretation to interpret it in a racist way, but their intention was not to be racist. So there's two senses in which a person might assert that an author could know both themselves and the meaning of the things that they produce, and it seems that for many reasons, post-psychoanalysis and the rest of it, we might doubt that an author would actually be self-aware enough to be recording their own mental states. But we'd also want to say that the author couldn't possibly have a complete understanding of the meaning of the things they're saying, because the meaning, it's a productive thing that they're doing. What they write down can produce many interpretations, and they can't possibly know all of them in one go. And I'm wondering if we should interpret also the activity of Gadamer here, or at least hermeneutics, as uncoupling teleology from interpretation, and saying that we should read the history of the practice of interpretation as being one in which there are certain purposes to which one can set the activity of interpretation, and then Gadamer comes along and says, well, if you look at across purposes, across disciplines, across ways of interpretation, you find common to each of them a kind of historical contingency, and if you want to claim or assert that your purpose is canonical or the most important one, then you're going to have to deal with the value, the utility, the possibility of there being, and the meaningfulness of other kinds of interpretations. So I mean, I think you can still save the interpretive practices of earlier literary criticism and so on, and still call them meaningful and still call them useful, as long as you properly contextualize the purpose to which they're setting their activity.
So do you think that it extends into the art realm? Because this is one of the pieces of the hermeneutics that I was most confused about. And I don't mean to derail the conversation away from where it's going. Again, I can't talk. I haven't slept. I feel like the art thing is where I spent most of my time this week talking to people about. How? Maybe you guys can clear it up for me. How do you see the two tasks of interpreting text versus interpreting art as different to Gadamer? And if there is no canonical meaning, how can we say that any art is better than another?
And the distinction between text and art comes, you can think about the philosophy of language, and you can talk about signifiers and symbols and stuff like that, versus aesthetics, right? So there's just the kinds of knowledge that you receive from a text, or whatever you receive from a text, versus what you receive from art. And then, we can get into the whole grammar versus aesthetics thing, right?
Yeah, I'm asking you guys.
Yeah, well, I'm not. See, the thing is, I haven't read the entirety of Truth and Method, so I really have no authority in which to offer an authoritative account of Gadamer. But it does seem like, on the basis of Gadamer's own charity towards interpretation, that he would say there are certain ways of producing interpretations, or certain ways of reading texts or pieces of art that would lend them to establishing standards of value, standards of better and worse, and under the light of those particular criteria of success or failure or good or bad, that you can in a group of people or in a collective of people engage in that kind of activity. Now, whether you want to say that your sense of good and your sense of bad and your particular way of interpreting art is somehow the end way of interpretation, that's not necessary for just making claims of better and worse. I can say a particular rap song is better or worse than another as a member of a community of people who listen to rap, and we can establish our own standards of value and our own ways of interpreting things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that in the precondition for that activity is that we are asserting to have the canonical meaning, or we're asserting the precondition for the activity is a common way of obtaining meaning from works of art. So,
okay, but is it possible, because I really want to be able to assert myself as superior over other people when it comes to my music being better than their music? Is it possible at all? Is there no way that we can ever arrive using hermeneutics? Seth?
I feel like we might be conflating something here, and what an aesthetic value judgment with an interpretive move. So I'm brought to mind of this something I learned when I was in college. I took a class on history, and we read a book where it sort of took different interpretive approaches to historical events. And I've done the same thing with visual art as well, where you can read a work of art as through through its symbols or its signification. You can read a work of art through its economic production. You can read a work of art based on the materials out of which it was created, all of which yield different kinds of understanding of that work of art. And when you read history, you can read it the same way. You can read the Salem witch trials as a religious event, or you can read them as a political event, or you can read them from a perspective of gender as a in that way. Any of these things yields a new way of understanding, a new kind of meaning, which, assuming that you have some kind of rigorous interpretive method, is a valid meaning. That doesn't mean that you make a judgment about whether the work of art is good or bad, or pretty or beautiful or not, or whether the activities, the actions of individuals in a historical event were moral or immoral. It's a question of getting meaning out of the events and the art itself.
And that relates to the intentionality of the subject, doesn't it? It depends on what you're trying, and that's where the economic and the culture or whatever you're trying to do interpret, looking at the text.
Yeah, it's part. I think that's part of the pre-understanding that Gadamer talks about. It's not just your assumptions and biases, but it's also your intention at approaching the text, what it is you're looking for.
So go on.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things you get in Gadamer as he does his readings is the discipline that he's bringing to bear becomes evident at any point. Basically what I'm saying is he's got his training as a philologist. So as he approaches these ancient texts, the ancient philosophers, the way he parses out meaning and the way he talks about roots or examples of historical uses, that is the tradition he's in at that moment, coming into a relationship with the subject matter he's trying to direct our attention towards. So if you're the historian, hopefully as you're approaching this, your work, the tradition, the way of thinking that's bringing you to this moment becomes evident in what you're writing, rather than just simply stating, making ex cathedra, statements about this is the case. You're not actually going to see the work I do to get towards the judgments that I'm making. So I mean, you can see him as a reader, but as a very particular kind of reader. He's not saying everyone's going to see this instantly. It's like, watch as I bring in the philological apparatus to clash with what's going on in these ancient Greek texts. This is why it's so beautiful to read. I mean, it's a great example of writing.
So I think for the purposes of aesthetic judgment, though, there's two things to say. One, I don't think he would object to indexing a notion of good and bad to a particular kind of interpretive method. So you could say this work of art is a good work of art under the light of its construction, or under the light of X, Y, Z ways of reading it, and then you would have a plural standards of good and bad. And I think it's also important to say that the contingency of things does not imply their subjectivity, which is something that I think gets very often. There's often hostility to people saying, well, things are historically contingent or contingent on one thing or another, and therefore we sort of have to give them up as merely subjective, that there's no objectivity to them. So to say that a reading of a text has to be, or is in some important sense, historically contingent, or however contingent it is, isn't to say that we can't have, for example, a notion of good and bad which is tracking something objective about that text. Just because it was constructed in such a way as relying on history does not mean that if we index aesthetic judgments to that particular way of interpreting, that we're ending up in just some whimful or wishful kind of morass. I do think it is possible to establish, a taste in things and to have a superior taste in them, insofar as you're engaging in a consistent kind of interpretation. and indexing a good notion of good and bad to that interpretation.
But of course, that way of interpretation can be historicized, surely.
Yes, but that doesn't imply its subjectivity. That's the point. It doesn't imply. So let's say radical subjectivity. It doesn't imply. Let's try and make this clear. I mean, the historical construction of a work of art doesn't imply that we can't read that work of art in terms of its forms or its signs and symbols and the rest of it. And if we do read it in that way, it doesn't mean that if we create a notion of good and bad, that our notion of good and bad isn't objective, because it is actually pertaining to something objective about that work in its forms and its structure and the rest of it, if that makes sense.
Sure.
It does.
I'm thinking about Shakespeare and his body of work and his life, how visceral. I mean, he was an underground Catholic, the religious wars going on. He's running this crazy business, the Globe Theater.
All over the place.
What's that?
I'm always thinking of Mark Rothko. I think that makes
spy apparatus all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to something as complicated as Shakespeare, you're in a very crazy kind of position where, in a way, almost the aspect of the art is constituted by its historical character. It's not merely constructed historically; it's actually constituted historically. I mean, I was thinking of something more like modern art, which, whilst constructed within history, right? Things were going on and feeding into it. It isn't constituted. It isn't made up of bits of history. That means that you can't have a reading of it which is tracking something objective about the structure of the work. So I think we have to differentiate between kinds of art. I'm not sure if we're going down a garden path here, but
no, I was not. I mean, obviously, the historical aspects of Shakespeare and the characters, whether it's closely tracking history or not. I was really thinking Shakespeare more in terms of just the production and examination of being, of human beings being in the world and their Heideggerian projects, if you will, and then juxtaposed to that sort of the sort of the Harold Bloom school of, well, it's just art, and you cannot we murder to dissect and overlay all of the cultural, social agendas, et cetera, et cetera. So. And it reminds me of Heidegger, which it feels like Heidegger's Being in Time was just this immense project to explore being, and he just crashed. It's too hard. So it's easier to sort of create these hermeneutic games to sort of make us feel like we're getting somewhere.
I would say that the kind of judgment which includes things worth doing, not doing, things that should be forgotten, or things that should be the classic that should be admired. It's not so much with Gadamer so much that you have to align your personal faculties to come up with a sound judgment. The model from Truth and Method is, in addition to the metaphor of games, which was addressed during the conversation, but he talks about the work of the legalist and the application of the text. So the judge is not just there saying what is the law? Is this law good or bad? The law must be applied to a case, out of which consequences are going to fall. Or a preacher must apply the text to a sermon, or an actor whose job it is to be Cordelia isn't going to offer a piece of literary criticism, but their application will be bringing it to an audience. So in all these cases, judgments aren't so much about alignments of faculties with external realities. They are the production of a changed world from that point forward. Getting up and leaving the gallery is a kind of application or a response to the text. It did speak to you. Now you're walking away from it. That would be the kind of, rather than just subjective judgment, it's the world of application that I think Gadamer was thinking about. You're like the actor. You're like the jurist. You're like the preacher when you have that text in front of you. You're not a geometer.
Yeah.
You're not a hipster at an indie rock show folding your arms and just looking at the stage feeling dissatisfied.
No, you got to stage dive.
Appease me. Appease the emperor. That's how I felt he was describing us. Anyway, it's a funny joke if you think about it. Go ahead, guys.
Eric, that's a really good point. That Gadamer uses the legal case as a paradigmatic case, and then when you guys listen to the episode on Ricoeur, you'll see, Ricoeur is trying to use hermeneutics to recover an interpretation of the apostolic announcement of salvation through Jesus Christ, which in essence is essentially the religious case, and those two cases really are paradigmatic. Gadamer's intent, though, is to argue that's actually required across the board, not just for a juridical or religious kinds of interpretation, but also any text, any event, and even history itself.
So could you expand on that a little bit more? Could you say what the activity of that involves, just for purpose of clarification?
So, well, I think Eric did a good job of talking about how, if you think of it this way, contrast the application of the law. So you have a series of disconnected legal devices. You might have some explicit law. You might have case law, which would establish some kind of precedent, and you may have some other mitigating factors. And the point is you're bringing those to bear in order to be productive, have a productive activity of creating a new case study or a new precedent, which is analogous to creating a new meaning, right? And it's historically situated, and in fact, it's very particular. It's particular to that case, and in turn, it may act as precedent or case law for somebody else in the future. Now, consider the way we usually think about philosophy is we think the text has an argument inherent in it, or it has meaning inherent in it, and most people would not characterize the act of interpreting a philosophical text as searching for precedent and guidance through previous philosophical texts in order to apply it to this particular text and come up with what you might call a particular meaning or a particular instance of a reading. And so that model does make sense when you apply it over into something like, at least with respect to preaching or live religious activity by a religious leader of a congregation. So what I was just trying to say was I think it's easier for us to accept the model as applied in the juridical and the religious context, less easy for us to accept it as applied to literature or philosophy, but it's Gadamer's contention that in fact all those texts, including not just works but also activities, events, and history, are in essence call for that type of interpretive activity.
If I may, what was brought to mind when you were describing the historical process was Nietzsche's, in the Genealogy of Morality, where he's talking about meaning as being evolutionary and always set to a new purpose, and every generation has the same inherits the same pieces of stuff, the same scripture, the rest of it, but it follows an evolutionary path that you can't take that people reuse the same activities and mean different things. And I wonder if there's a distinction then between... the thing is, it's very difficult to get away from this intuition that there is, certainly in a philosophical text, if you look at the ontological argument for God or something, it does feel like, there's the ontological argument for God, and, people are writing this stuff down. It may approach it or may not, but that's what they're getting at, and it's just this thing that's out there, the ontological argument. And I guess Gadamer's saying that's not true. But I'm wondering if
maybe it has to do with... Sorry.
Go on.
Go ahead, Michael.
was going to say, I'll just be very quick. I wonder if there's a slight sleight of hand that Gadamer's making here. I wonder if he's sort of pointing out situations where we repurpose things and situations where there are plurality of interpretations, and saying because we repurpose things, there's plurality of interpretations, and I think that would be a non sequitur. That okay, there could be one interpretation. That doesn't mean that when people use that in different ways to different ends, to apply it differently, that doesn't mean or doesn't undermine there being a canonical interpretation. I agree with Gadamer ultimately that there isn't, but I'm just wondering if his argument there is actually logically sound.
If I could jump in, can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other paradigmatic case is theater. That is early on when he's talking about play and that sort of thing, and putting on a play. The actor that embodies any of, say, Shakespeare's great characters, you see that every once in a while, maybe a performance of a generation or something like that, where someone really captures Lear or Hamlet or someone like that, and yet it's just as valid for the high school student to try their hand at those kinds of things, and yet we recognize there is a almost qualitative difference between what's happening by the raw amateur actor that are attempting to get inside Shakespeare's words, and then the true master that is able to let us see the play in a whole new different light. And for Gadamer, it seems to me that that motion that the actor brings to bear, that is somewhat the entire discipline of their career and life and all that sort of thing, so that the play can stand, the play can speak. That has always been helpful to me as a way of understanding the motion that Gadamer seems to want to talk about. And so that does seem to let us talk about strong readings. But of course, in ages to come, there will be other strong readings, things that we cannot even imagine, right? Does that make sense, what I'm saying there?
It does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what I'm starting to hear is some people, I mean, we're tussling with this text as well. I heard, there's an earlier speaker, some sense of do we want to be critical at some point, or are people going to address problems, or are we going to save that till later? Are we just going to try to be as much charity as possible in the time we have, or
Toward Gadamer or each other?
Towards Gadamer. Towards Gadamer.
Oh, okay.
Here's a question that I have between 7-8 years ago, and I felt like he really explained to me how I go understanding a text, and I feel like I was just reading what was happening in my own mind, and he gave me words and language to really put that, to be able to explain to someone else what I was trying to do when I was reading. And part of what I just said is bringing that sense of the allowing the text to speak as clearly and forcefully as possible, as like a master actor would, letting Shakespeare speak or something like that. Later in the book, he does say something like, "Being that can be understood is language," and he seems to say that all true understanding is mediated through language. I'm a young father. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and watching them acquire language has been one of the most profound experiences of my life. They know things before they had access to language, but their knowing is very different than their understanding. My 3-year-old has begun to understand things because he has language. And so I'm really curious about what Gadamer how he would understand the difference between something like the embodied raw knowledge that my 1-year-old knows that he is safe. He knows that he is loved and cared for. But my 3-year-old has a larger grasp on that than even the 1-year-old. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there, as an example?
It makes a lot of sense. It's actually quite interesting in terms of, it may offer us kind of may offer some means to understand what he's saying. I mean, I found what Michael said about the ontological argument quite interesting, and I think the way Gadamer would go about it certainly I think has to do with language, right? Because if you think
Right.
about philosophical arguments, especially arguments which are conducted through the use of, I mean, all arguments are conducted using logic, but there is an element of when you do philosophy that you are to some extent in a community of people who need to agree on defining terms a certain way and so on. And if you've studied formal logic, you enter into this sort of rigid ahistorical means of symbolizing certain arguments and so on and so on. And in that case, I think that offers us a clue as to why the ontological argument would stay, and why, in the case of say I don't know if legal arguments or legal interpretation, I suppose, of what we were referring to what we were talking about before, or in the case of a theatrical interpretation of a part, how there isn't necessarily, obviously isn't the same sort of community towards ahistorical meaning, which requires this kind of homogeneity of language as there is in logic, right? In the case of case law, you're trying to sorry?
No,
I thought I heard someone.
Yeah, no. I'm just keep rolling. You're on a good track.
Sure, but in the case of case law, to say it a weird way, you're in a way trying to when you're interpreting when you're laying down legal precedent, it is this kind of, you're trying to enforce the heritage of the community in a way, right? Because that's the kind of presupposition of case law, right? Like you agree that the interpretation of the person in the future, when you have a system of case law, in some sense you agree on that the interpretation of the person who is reading this particular statute will be appropriate. In some sense, you're vesting some trust into those who come after you, right? So maybe purposiveness, distinction between, let's say, legal and theatrical and philosophical, where text, purposiveness and language would be the key to differentiating between them.
Everett, as you were speaking, I was reminded of this week there was another in Charlie Rose's Brain series, and I didn't get through all of it, but they were talking about aggression and some of the new research in aggression, and they were beginning of the show they were focusing on children, and in this they've identified in this 2 to 4 year old area where they are actually maximally aggressive. And as I was watching, these clips of kids and how they're figuring out, where they are in the world, am I safe? How do I get safety, territory, toys, all that? I'm thinking like, okay, well, this must be some form of pre-language. As you were saying, your kids know things before they have language, but it's a different knowing. But just a final point being, I don't think that hardwiring pre-language knowing ever goes away. And so we have language on top of all of that, and we sort of fool ourselves into thinking, well, that's, language is this nice, clean thing that we can look at words and move things around.
Language is definitely messy for Gadamer. But he does seem to follow Heidegger to the end in that Heidegger's phrase that being is the house of language, right? And yet both of them point to points of an embodied knowledge that, like, in just the paradigmatic cases of art and all these things, of these sensory these embodied things that speak to us. I mean, it's just one of the things that I've been wrestling with as I've been watching my children, because up to this point, I mean, I can't remember a time when I couldn't read. It's just language is such a part of my life, and it's how I understand myself and all that sort of thing. And so as I was reading Gadamer before I had children, I was like, this seems right in so many ways, in so many cases. It just seems like one of the I'm looking for something where more recent philosophy and maybe have taken up this question of what are some of these limits of knowing, and what are the limits of language, and all that sort of thing. Like, I mean, Wittgenstein says the limits of my language are the limits of my world, and the analytic tradition generally takes that to say we can't speak of these things beyond language. But the Continentals, broadly speaking, understand or recognize that there are many cases that are worth speaking toward or about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I wouldn't say the characterization of the difference between analytic and continental philosophy there is entirely accurate, however. I mean, I think when Wittgenstein said, whereof one cannot speak, one should be silent, he was saying something tautological, that if you can't say it, you can't say it. And I think that the ostension, which is to say just pointing things out in the world, is something
Sure.
that both traditions place a high value on. I mean, I'm wondering if we just get back to the particular use of continental self-reflection here. That I mean, I personally think in certain aspects of continental philosophy, a great deal of weight is placed on language to do far too much than it actually does. I think you often find in a moment of linguistic reflection where you're putting things into words, but what you're also doing is being self-reflective, is taking yourself as an object of your own thought and saying, well, I am doing this, and I am doing that. And I think
I
it
am
is that,
producing a true proposition at this point to shove
yes.
it to the world. Yeah.
And I think it is that activity which is actually the one that's doing most of the lifting, the heavy work there. And I think it being coincident with language is something that can mislead people into thinking that language is the thing that's doing it. And I would be open to the possibility that certain pre-linguistic animals, if you want to put it that way, are capable of saying to themselves, looking in a mirror or something, in a certain kind of way, oh, I am here doing this, and there is paint on my face, and the rest of it, but not formulating that in a linguistic way, and yet still participating in that moment of self-reflection, which I think is actually the key thing that I mean a lot of people are pointing to, Heidegger and the rest of them, and I think this labor talk of language is, I don't know, personally I don't want to get the whole thing off track, but personally I think that there's a bit too much weight placed on that to do a great deal.
Yeah, I know in some of his writings about the visual art that the importance of the gesture that is made by the painter, or the gesture that is somehow embodied, even in a non-representational piece of art, that somehow offers a world to the viewer, and in that there is truth. So the sticking point for me is very hard for me, is to talk about truth that comes through things that are not propositions or empirically confirmable statements. I feel so it borders on mysticism for me. That's my own prejudice, right? It's
Well, if I might offer an example, perhaps a controversial one that I was thinking about yesterday, and it's to do with consent to sex, right? There's some movements on campuses at the moment that saying you should provide explicit, and what they mean there is linguistic assent. You say you should ask, do you want to have sex, and then wait until someone says yes. But if the other person's taking your clothes off, surely in their gestures, that's as explicit as it's ever going to get. And I don't think that somehow the linguistic saying of yes, let's have sex is actually more explicit than someone taking your clothes off. Like, there's still the same amount of interpretive freedom there in both cases. Someone saying yes, and someone taking your clothes off. I think in those gestures, I think we should recognize this, how explicit and how self-aware and how self-reflective and the rest of it we can be in our activities, in our actions, not just in the moments where we're rendering them in the language. And I think this mystical, I think it's quite the opposite actually. I think it becomes mysticism when we attribute to linguistic acts, the act of saying yes, for example, a certain kind of sacredness or reverence that that getting naked doesn't have, you know.
I would, Eric, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So this conversation is like identical to the conversation that Mark and I had when we were reading on the Essence of Truth, the Heidegger essay. And, you know, Heidegger's contention, and I think Gadamer is certainly taking from this, I know that Ricoeur is, and there were others, is that truth as correspondence, which is what you're describing, it is one way to look at truth, but it itself is only made possible by what he considered to be a sort of more fundamental notion of truth, which is about how things reveal and conceal themselves in being to us, you know, to Dasein, as it. And I don't want to get too much into the what's the word I'm looking for? That I don't want to get into the jargon.
Yeah, I appreciate those arguments. I find myself at a dead end. I'm not able to stay
Fair enough.
in that vein. That's the challenge in discussing. I mean, I could, you know, parse the parts of truth and method, for, you know, 48 hours a day nonstop because I love the book so much. But to really enter into that notion of, you know, the truth that comes out through a gesture is very hard for me to say. And I know there are people, there's, you know, whole traditions of philosophy that, you know, endeavor to do this. I find it really hard to do.
Fair enough.
I mean, philosophically speaking, I think that Gadamer is on fairly solid ground to say that being that can be understood is language. I'm curious how he would speak to the problems of ostension, perhaps, for lack of a better.
So insofar as you understand something, you're talking about. So that would be saying that insofar as you understand something in the text, that pertains to your being, or sorry, your understanding is solely linguistic. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, or rather, what Gadamer means.
Well, I think it's open to interpretation. I think the structuralists and post-structuralists would take a claim like being is linguistic or something to mean that their understanding and existence and the rest of it is structured like a language. And so it would have a sense of an analogy with form. I've no real idea. I mean, it's a bit opaque to me what it could mean, to be honest. I think ultimately it's just coming down to an intuition that I think is mistaken, that there's some purely self-reflective component that can be abstracted away and identified as being the essence of understanding. And I don't think that's true. I think that the dogs understand things and cats understand things, and not necessarily moments of self-reflection either. But I think I'm rambling. I mean, it's opaque to me what that means. But under the post-structuralist sense, it just means that if you look at the structure of a language and you look at the structure of anything else, that the two have participate in the same kind of structures. But I'm not sure that that's what Gadamer would mean.
Hey, can I say a few things?
Please.
I actually studied under a post-structuralist during my university time. One thing that my post-structuralist prof said to me was, there is no view from nowhere. So what she basically meant that you need to have a position, a perspective on things to actually understand interpreting, correct? So
Chris,
I think we have to talk about the context of what. Yes?
You cut out for a second. Can you repeat what you said right there?
W here in Winnipeg, one of my profs in my politics class was labeled a post-structuralist. So one of the things that she talked about was that there is no view from nowhere. Basically meaning that you need to pick a position and have or a perspective to know what we're actually interpreting. So context, basically. Do you guys understand? What kind of context are we interpreting?
I would say that something Gadamer would. Didn't Gadamer say something along the lines of that you can enter into a sort of mode of objectivity with respect to a text by just saying, is it true, or something along those lines? That does it correspond to reality, or something like that? So I don't know. There's definitely a mood in some post-structuralist people that the lack of a view from nowhere equates to there being no way to treat a text as though it is trying to say something about reality.
Yeah.
that just being not being able to enter from the point of view of God means that there is actually no reality to the text, no correspondence to the text at all. So I think just be careful about saying that.
Right. And this is the thing with Gadamer as well. You will have people coming off of Derrida saying, well, when you are interpreting, there is nothing outside of the text. Rather than text and context, there's an infinite text which shades out from this, this little book or poem that's in front of you on the table right now. And the kind of work that a philologist or preacher would do is you can take anything from any part of the text and relate it to this. There's basically no limits. There's the deconstructionists will say there's no difference between text and context. And I just wondered if, I don't think Gadamer addresses that explicitly, but the tradition he's coming out of distinguishes between text and context. It doesn't go between that radical Derridian extent.
Gadamer's pretty confident that the text can. Gadamer's pretty confident that any given text can, at times, break through to a new horizon. Right?
Yes.
Exactly.
And that meaning can stand at least for a time. And as opposed to, I feel like he's frustrated with the neo-Kantian of his forebears. But I think he's also frustrated with the deconstructionist tendency of his contemporaries, and saying that we can arrive at a certain degree of meaning. It's not perhaps nailed down as much as we would have liked in past eras, but
yes, that there is a strong sense that you're interpreting or something has come from a world. There are strong ontological commitments, and then the deconstructionists will just say, well, we are just entering a world of signs. But whereas there's something very strong in Gadamer is that this came from a history, a world is making itself present to you. So the horizon is not the same as, let's say, a rigid textual scholar of the 19th century would say, this is context. A horizon is something broader than that, but you just don't have this, infinite weaving of signs. So there's strong ontological commitments in Gadamer.
Sorry, what you seem to be saying in terms of I kind of detect I haven't read Hegel that much, but then again, who has? Well, I'm sure people have, but
the Aesthetics is the only one I read. So.
But what seems to me to be the important thing doesn't seem to be science as much as you talked about the world that the text comes from. It seems to me to be the history. Seems to me to be if you wanted to do the one-word summation, and one-word summations are a notoriously bad guide to philosophy. But in this case, history seems to be appropriate. And you talked about world seemed to me to relate to Geist or spirit, and the interaction between you and the text, and the way that not just subject and not just object, right? He's not a post-structuralist or a radical subjectivist in the sense that it's all about perspective and you're just projecting onto the text and so on and so on. And it's not about the text in itself, whatever that means. It's about the interaction between the two, or more specifically, the historically contingent interaction between the two, which doesn't mean the interaction is subjective, merely that it's rather, it doesn't mean the interaction is the interaction is totally up to you, but it does mean that it's up to history, I guess, in a way. I mean, I'm going about expressing this in a really bad way. I hope you guys understand.
You phrase it quite nicely. Yeah, I think I would agree.
Well, I mean, not to sound too cheeky, but I mean, there's a difference between texts which, yeah, okay, you know, so we can talk about biblical texts as having import, but why not talk about the hermeneutics of Mein Kampf and the reading of Mein Kampf? And so there's a distinction between choice in the world, which really is not grounded in language. Choice is choice. There are a lot of reasons around choice, and there's a real distinction between living inside one's reasons and rationalities versus your pure choice. But the two of them, Heidegger and Gadamer, clearly had some, you know, they approached that situation of choice and, you know, identity and reading and close reading with different, and I don't want to sound too cheeky, but seems like those two were faced with some pretty important stuff that they seem to navigate differently, and I don't know if that relates to anything we're talking about, but I always get uncomfortable when discussions just get so in the air about, well, what would the post-structuralists say and all that. It's just, you know.
Yeah.
I'm not well enough read in those areas to carry on those discussions, but I don't know if anybody thinks that's interesting to talk about.
Yeah, I didn't want to push anyone in that direction, but I know from around Gadamer, you'll have people who say, well, you know, he's conservative, he wants to tie people's understanding to traditions, and then you'll have people like E.D. Hirsch who's saying, you know, this is wildly irresponsible, this, you know, this indifference to determining a single solid truth, this will lead to all sorts of trouble. So that's the conversation and the controversy around this book and some of Gadamer's ideas.
Well, I mean, there's two debates. Well, that's not two debates. I mean, there's two pushing and pulling grounds in the whole tradition of idealism. I think, which, from my opinion, ought to include phenomenology, but that's controversial. But in any case, there's two sort of sticking points. One is the boundary around the mind, whether you just have consciousness or whether you have multiple minds, and how the veil of perception works and all that kind of stuff. And the other one is about the creative power of consciousness or the creative power of the mind, and how much we attribute to its creativity. I mean, the later people wanted to attribute everything to the creative power of the mind, that all you really were doing is interpreting endlessly, and the reality was just in your endless interpretation. And I think Heidegger and perhaps, well, certainly Gadamer as well, but Heidegger in particular coming out of that was not willing to go to that extreme. He was saying, no, there is a world, and you are creative, but your creativity doesn't consist in in this endless, bottomless, almost chasing the dragon nihilism. It's about how you respond to that world in certain ways. You don't have total freedom. You're not in a everything's not just open for choice. There's a creative aspect to your engagement with things. When you engage with a text, there's tremendous sort of production that you're doing to create new interpretations and the rest of it. But you don't have an endless amount of leeway. There are standards to approach it with. There are ways you can go about doing these things. There are traditions. There are things you can look at, the history of things. There is something to ground your approach. So
would that be ethics?
Gadamer calls it authority.
Yep.
Just comes flat out and says it's a question of authority. The tradition and authority and community, very loaded words.
Because if you did have this endless freedom to interpret, right, you would be ahistoricizing the subject.
These people don't really. These people.
No, but that's my point about Gadamer, right? Like, if you are a historicist, or if you believe in the, the thing is, I'm not well read enough in Hegel. I don't want to, and this is the kind of what I'm trying to apply to him, and I don't want to necessarily call him a historicist exactly, but I do think that if you were to talk about this person, this kind of free mind who can create unto himself without respect to any boundaries, that would be an ahistorical category, and I don't think he wants to be ahistorical.
And also the fantasy that you can have or be in the same creative moment of the original audience or creators. So that's the idea that the historicist, that your mind can, if you are educated enough and sympathetic enough, your mind can freely float through any period in time. And if you're in the right subjective state and you have the right knowledge, you can think like a Greek in the theater of Dionysus, or you could think and imagine as Sophocles thought and imagined. And he's saying, no, the truth that's going on here is not that.
History gives you structure, but it also gives you freedom.
Yes, yeah. It's not that you were jumping over the history that extends between you and that ancient time. That history is a power or force or a support to your understanding. It's not something you leap over or pretend it doesn't exist.
The way I think about the certain debates in continental philosophy is very much very infantilizing in a way. Team Germany and Team France, and I'm very much on Team Germany in this case.
I'm on Team England.
I'm on Team Scotland. We're devolving.
I guess I'm probably the referee.
I'm saying the experience of watching the PEL community jump into this book was wonderful. You guys sounded so engaged. It was really remarkable. I thought we were going to have Mark here as well. That's what I was hoping for. But all of you just seemed to be bouncing off it in your own way, but not obscuring it. It was a great little hermeneutic festival going on.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. How do we, considering that we're talking about hermeneutics, how do we interpret ourselves in terms of how we're interpreting this particular, the kind of, because we're to some extent engaging in the activity that we're, talking about.
I would consult an analyst first.
Yeah, fair enough.
Before you end up in the hysteria.
I was gonna talk about history as being the real, but I've read even less of Lacan than I've read of Hegel, so I'm gonna getting right off that.
Yeah, you're on to something. I'm not exactly sure how to phrase it, but yeah, it's not. It's not a nightmare from which you try to awake. It's something else. You can't awaken from it, even if you try.
I don't know. I mean, there's two attributes that something that's real must have. It must insist upon you in some way, and it must speak to you in some way, I think. Now, I mean, we won't have to speak. The word "speaking" there has like linguistic connotations, but I mean something like that. If something is real, that you don't have complete control over it. You can't just arbitrarily demand of it one thing or another. That if something is there, that it insists upon you in a way that you engage with it in particular ways. And if water's wet, then you experience the wetness. It just that's it. And the other one, that you must be able to engage with it in some way, that you can sort of understand that it is wet and you can apply it to certain things and the rest of it. And it seems like when you spoke of authority, and I sort of missed that word was. I sort of missed that really. I think authority seems such a wonderful way of describing it because it has that dual character of being something that insists upon you. That there's an authority and you can try rebelling against it, but I think if it is a good authority, that you aren't going to get very far. And it is demanding of you in certain ways, and it does speak to you in certain ways. And that reality does seem to have those. Well, say reality, the things that are real, does seem to have that prescriptive and insistive aspect to it. And in a way that if you're giving history that status of being an authority, you're saying that there is something with respect to, there's an authority with respect to which you can listen to it, you can be under its power, and you can't just ignore it. You can pretend to yourself, you can engage a kind of fantasy of ahistoricalness and the rest of it, but that's just a fantasy, a delusion.
Sorry, could you just repeat the two characteristics of the real?
Well, these are just pet things that
Number one,
little things. The two characteristics that I was thinking of are that it insists upon you in some way, and the second one was that it speaks to you in some way.
Right.
Now,
And this upon you means you can't ignore it, right? That's what.
not quite. It means that it's a bit like it's a bit Lockean, really, that it's dispositional or something that it creates in you, or it causes you to experience something, or it demands a disclosure in a particular kind of way, if we put it in Heideggerian language, that encountering something is not a purely creative act. It's a situation where something is pushing back on you, and you're pushing back on it, and it's insisting you in some way, upon you in some way.
Right. And the second one was it speaks to you, or what was it exactly?
Yeah, something along those lines, that you can interpret it, that it has an. Well, I don't want to say it has an infinite mind. That would be committing myself to propositions which are questionable. But there are certainly different ways of I don't want to say listening to it, but something like, if there's one fixed meaning, if there's one determinate, complete and total and fixed meaning to something, then you have to be suspicious about its reality. Reality is not determinate, fixed. It's not, even if you're a scientist, right? If you take just take an experience of a ball dropping, that can equally account for Newtonian physics or general relativity or the rest of it. There's lots of different systems, paradigms within science that equally account for the same phenomena. So reality has to be compatible with lots of different ways of going about investigating it.
Right. So in that sense, so it's interpretable but not infinitely interpretable.
Well, I think these are different debates, but I mean the point is that it is interpretable.
And Kant is in some way the devil. The Kantians are the devil, but it's sort of a fortunate fall. The way Kant started talking about aesthetics took it in this highly subjectivist direction, but he accomplished a few things that were quite essential. And this is I can't remember where it is in the third critique, but Kant talks about if you have an aesthetic experience of, let's say, something that was beautiful and formally perfect, you need that thing made of stone, or that the sounds of that poem. You cannot. What is proper to aesthetic judgment is not a series of propositions that can be delivered in any format. It's that painting that you had a response to with your faculties, the truth or the beauty that you found in that. That's what's key to the experience. So even when Gadamer starts saying, it's like, we're not really talking about what's valuable about art or a text isn't this alignment of your personal private faculties. It does have something to do with that unavoidable, the ideas that you get from it or the truth you find in it cannot be separated out from the material through which you came to realize it, right? There is no truth or beauty that you can just hold in your head without reference to statues. That statue or the statue we've a community seen.
You express your being in material objects.
Yeah, when we are talking about the culture that we are criticizing or judging or tradition we're working from, it cannot be abstracted out from those remnants that we have some sort of we can point to somehow.
So it has to be objective in some sense, surely then.
Yeah. There has to be things that you have experienced that we could experience too, and we're not just limiting it to its formal qualities, but to say if we're going to talk about, the Belvedere Apollo, that you need to at least see a picture of it. You need to know it's got, it's like this and
right.
Not like something else. So
but where does the history come into that then? So how would you relate the object to the?
It's a bit like saying, let's put it this way. So first of all, what's being said is something like this: that when you listen to a melody, you aren't seeing the planet Jupiter.
Correct.
Right? I mean, you can respond in lots of different ways to the melody. One person can respond one way, and one person can respond another way, but you aren't seeing the planet Jupiter. there is something it is to be listening to a melody, and it is on the melody is there, and it's insisting upon you in one way or another.
I can't come up to you and say there's this 7-minute piece in 7/4 time, and it's called Mars, and you get a feeling of war from it. No, I actually have to sit you down, and you have to listen to that, or at least King Crimson attempting to play it.
Yeah, and you may not get the feeling of war from it.
You need to hear that dum da 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 dum da 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 dum da 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 ba.
Yeah, and that piece is going to, you may by not being able to hear it properly, or you may have a different relationship to it or something, but you may not get that from it.
Mm-hmm.
But what you won't get from it is, being cold and shivering. You won't sit there listening to it and then suddenly shiver, right? There's not total contingency all the way down. It's not, there's not a radical contingency to everything. There's something at the base of things which is there insisting on you in one particular way. And that's true of the historical context of something, that okay, you can investigate the historical contingencies behind things, but there's a limit to which you can say that this particular factor influenced or was relevant or salient to particular interpretation. You can't just say, well, I've understood this particular historical component, and therefore it just means anything. It doesn't just mean anything. It means a particular subset of things, or it bears on the interpretation in a particular subset of ways.
And I think if there's an implicit cultural politics in the text that we're assigned for the reading, it seems to me that those cultures, it is a good thing to keep for a community to focus on certain exemplary works, that those cultures, like the wicked French, who concentrate too much on abstract ideas or rationalism, are making a mistake. I mean, there's some of his biases make themselves quite apparent.
I don't know if there is the thing that's I'm not sure that you can kind of a priorize it. Maybe maybe in principle, right? I just find it slightly problematic to say that in principle there are, let's say, n amount of ways to interpret the text.
Yeah, he's not. I don't think he's interested in that.
Or maybe that I didn't get your point. Perhaps maybe.
Yeah, maybe I didn't have one. So.
I'm not. Yeah, I don't think he has to be committed to an in principle or a priori determination of what a text, how many ways a text can be interpreted. I mean, I am personally sympathetic to the idea that there's an infinite number of ways of interpreting it, and each is contextualized by a certain series of goals and ways of methodology and the rest of it. But whether he says that or not, all he's committed to is saying that interpretation is a synthetic activity. That, in putting Kantian terms, that the activity of interpreting text is synthetic. That it involves all your experiences. It involves the text. It involves the background and everything else. That the text isn't in commune with an a priori reading. The text isn't like trying to reach out to this God somewhere that's called the meaning. And what you're trying to do when you read the text and sit down and try and get in the mind of the author and have a drink of whiskey or something, that you're trying to sort of space out and commune with this particular God. I mean, it's all he's committed to is saying that no, that activity is not the case. That it's a purely synthetic activity. It's one of experience. It's one of engagement. It's one of contingency in very important ways, and that he may even say that necessarily means that there has to be a plurality of interpretations because everyone isn't the same, and every text isn't the same, and every way of relating things between things isn't the same. So that I think that probably entails there being a plurality, but I don't think it entails a particular plurality of interpretation.
Right. But it does. But if you're committed to the notion of historicizing interpretation, the amount of historical contingency is necessarily limited by history itself, right? Like, depends on So in that sense, but the thing is, talking in terms of limits is just not the way that I particularly thought about it. Like, but the way I think about it is in terms of subjectivity, like complete subject versus a complete object, and the way I think about or rather, I don't want to say the neo-Kantian, whatever, the text as God view. Let me call it that. The text as God view seems to me to completely disregard the subject into teaching a single text having a single teleological meaning, and the subjective view seems to be talking about the subject inventing his own meaning, and the way that I personally get to Gadamer's view is to talk about the interaction between the subject and the object. I mean, that's just my particular idiosyncratic way of putting it.
And
go on.
I don't know if we haven't addressed that particular term. You want big old German words, but the act of doing history is key. So it's not just anything like a subjective synthesis or a reference to Platonic ideal. There must be a Wirkungsgeschichte, an effective history taking place now, by making a judgment, by doing an interpretation, by offering an interpretation here and now. You are active within history. Again, that's a term that intrigues me. I'm not exactly sure how to appropriate it.
I guess I would bring it back to my insisting kind of thing. That I would think when you said effective history, I thought, okay, what you mean there is a history that insists upon you. But so I think the subject-object characterization of stuff, whether it's dialectical or metaphysical or stuff, can be very misleading sometimes. Because we have people in one camp, the objectivity camp, and they have these different visions, and we have people in the subjectivity camp, and they have these different visions. And it doesn't mean that someone who is in neither is just a synthesis of one of both, right? It's not the case that Gadamer is saying, oh, it's you're in a creative communion with God. It's that the objectivity consists in history and the not just history, but in authority, right? That you creatively engage with authority. It's not a simple reading of one position plus another position and then coming out with something in the middle. But I wondered if we could get back to something that was said earlier, where I think it was Eric said something like that we should dispense with the fantasy that we can get in the mind of the author or the emotional state of the author.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I mean, that sounds on the face of it so obvious and so plausible. But then there's certain moments where, so many times, so consistently, people who have a very similar understanding and background and history with respect to a musical composition or a text or wherever it is, a domain of music, a genre of music, or whatever, to that domain, and they all come out saying similar things like, I got to a moment where I understood the emotional direction of this piece of music. I mean, if you listen to Beethoven's Fifth like 100 times, you can sort of get a sense of the teasing, arrogance or whatever you want to call it. But there's a limit to a kind of a limit in the sense of an infinite limit. There's a limit to the emotionality of something that you can get, that feels like something you can get to. And it feels like that's not just on the basis of arbitrary interpretive methodology. It feels like there actually is a community of people who are gathering technical knowledge, like scientific knowledge, and then coming to a limited case understanding. I was wondering if you could either criticize.
I think your key word there is community, and I think Gadamer would use the word tradition.
And this is why the insistence on language and poetry. I find odd, because I was looking at some stuff about the phenomenology of hearings, Don Edict, and they were talking about, if you pick up a musical score is instruction on how to perform a number of very, very tricky actions to bring a sound into the world, and I don't know if I'm feeling the same thing that Beethoven did when he tinkled on his piano, but when I try to do Für Elisa on guitar, these indications on the text are making me create certain frequencies that other people have done in a similar way, and we are understanding or interpreting those inscriptions. But I don't know if that's the same experience as reading any other text. It's so silent, but it also seems so strong and undeniable, right? I am touching a pianoforte the way someone could in the future and the way someone in the past did. That seems to be very different from reading a work of philosophy or a poem, or it isn't. I mean, there's something, I think Gadamer would insist on knowing that is interpretation, but hard to bring it back to the world of propositions.
Well, that's kind of why I brought it up, because I mean it does seem, I don't know, I mean it really does seem like there is something. Oh, look, maybe we should add to authority a sense of vitality to the piece or something. That there is something in the structure of the piece that is also part of authority. That it's not just that everything external to the piece isn't just the authority. That actually, in the way that the piece is structured, the kind of piece that it is, whether it is played on a piano or whatever it may be, that if a composer sets a certain period of time for a time period for certain bars, or it has a certain number of semiquavers or something, that entails something physically about how fast you have to move. And you aren't free to be moving that quickly and just be thinking, oh, this is nice. You have to be impassioned in a certain way in order to just be able to sort of physically do that. So
it has to speak to you. You mean?
Pardon?
It has to speak to you.
Yes.
Well, I don't want to overload things with my own little pet.
Sorry, it just seems to work quite well for me.
Yeah.
When you talk about Beethoven, it's funny that you brought that up, because I was going to bring that up in another context, which I'll tag on to the end of this. But Beethoven was, just at a physical level, he played so hard that they were always trying to design pianos, actually a lot of them in London, to withstand his playing. So just the simple instrument that Beethoven was playing on was kept changing. Then he was a great improviser. I mean, so the notion that there is one version of Moonlight Sonata, whatever, that the notes look the same on the page is Beethoven would have put slightly different notes every time he sat down. The notion that there's a community that has coalesced around the right feeling or meaning of any one piece, I think, has not much to do with Beethoven. It's a history of listening, of hearing, and when people are either playing it badly, they still may be fantasizing about hearing, Daniel Barenboim or Horowitz playing it. That's not the same thing. So I mean that the Beethoven example brings up interesting issues. The story I was going to tell is I lived in China recently for a few years, and of course they've been gaga about Lang Lang for so long, and they'd always ask me what I thought, and if they wanted to know what I really thought, it was he's passionate and he gets all the notes right, and but unless you've steeped yourself in 19th century Romantic literature and all that, I mean it's very hard. Beethoven's not about the notes. Mm-hmm. And so when they would push back, I would say, okay, an American gets off the plane in Shanghai and he boils the water at the right temperature and puts the right number of tea leaves in the. Do you consider that American to be a master tea maker? And they just scoff at that. Making tea in China is this incredible history of, and every time you do it, you're evoking all of this, the community that I forget who made mention of before. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting when we get away from words and texts and hermeneutics, that as we get into these other art forms, it all gets pretty complicated.
But it is those things that truth is like, rather than it seems to me is that these writers, Gadamer, Heidegger, is to understand truth in those terms. Like when you pick up a philosophical text or a poem or something, what you should consider truth is something like that, which dwells inside a gesture or the playing of a piece of music. It just for a kind of word addict like myself, it's an uncomfortable thing to try to do.
I just want to pick up on something you said there. You said that Beethoven is not about that, or a phrase to that extent.
Wait, say that again. Beethoven is not.
You said something like Beethoven. You said you made a scathing critique of a of a piano player, and you said, well, he's very impassioned and he plays the right notes. It's an awfully English way of putting it. So that was. And then you said Beethoven's not about that, but then that entails that there is something Beethoven is about. And when you said and this is something that this is a recurring, I think, conflation that happens very frequently in areas like this. That you say, well, an amateur can be believing this, and a professional can be believing this, and because they both have the same psychological state, they both can be convinced that they're really getting to the heart of things. That there is no getting to the heart of things. No. The amateur's wrong. The amateur just is confused. If there's an amateur putting on of Beethoven's Fifth and they're doing it badly, they're doing it badly. They can be deluded and they can take as many drugs as they like and come to the conclusion that they're really getting to the heart of Beethoven, but they're wrong. And a professional might be right. I think there is really something. I'm not sure how this will be cashed out in terms of hermeneutics, but it does really feel like there's something that's in the structure of the piece, you might say, that's in the the structure of the piece is such that you had to have new pianos in order to play it. You yourself said that the actual piece itself is insisting on reality in such an extreme way as to create new instruments in order for it to be played. I mean, there seems to be such a power to the very form of its composition and the very direction of its playing and the rest of it, that it can't just be this abyss behind the notes. It does feel like there's some kind of emotional or psychological or whatever you want to call it background to things that maybe you can get to. I mean, that's very anti-Gadamerian, but there you go.
Yeah,
May I interject something here real quick?
Please.
So one of the things that's interesting about this conversation is that you guys, I think, have taken it to the place that somebody who has read a lot more Gadamer than we did would take it. Specifically, you're talking a lot about art, which is something that I don't want to say we glossed it, but we didn't read anything essential other than some reference at the beginning of Truth and Method to the notion that he has two essential things in his thought. One is about the notion of play. The other is that this is very much intended to be a strategy for interpreting art as well, and we didn't really touch on those themes. So I just want to point out that this probably makes a lot more sense to those of you that have read more Gadamer. For anybody else who's on the call who maybe only listened to our episode, myself included, I'm extrapolating from what I have read to try and follow the thread of the conversation. But I want to say it's a really interesting. It's interesting that getting this confluence of the three or four of you together who have that background to talk about this has totally opened a whole nother dimension. I also need to point out that Stephen had to leave the call early on an emergency, so he's still hosting it, running on his unattended computer. And I'm going to have to leave here in about 15 minutes or so. But we're going to let the recording go, so you guys can keep going, or we can, I can see if I can transfer control to somebody else, and we'll take whatever you guys want to give. But I just wanted a procedural note there.
Well, I'm gonna. Yeah, it's getting toward dinner time here in lovely Toronto, Canada.
You're in Toronto. I'm in Toronto as well.
Oh wow! I was just in Toronto.
Are you the guy just in the next room? No.
No, I'm not. No.
It's 5 minutes past 11 p.m. at night here, so.
Wow.
I'm in Calgary, so it's just a bunch of Canadians here.
Winnipeg.
Closing thoughts.
Paris of the Prairies. But you said that again this stuff is new to you, but this wasn't really talked about in Austin, in Texas. Gadamer, Heidegger, anything to do with the past philosophy of history?
No, not when we were at the university. No, there was an intense political division in the department between the analytic, it was the height of the analytic versus continental thing in academia. Our department had some very strong people in the middle. So we had some classicists. We had Hankinson, we had Muralatos, we had Woodruff, who were all classicists.
You had Rob Sullivan.
Was he there?
I think
when I was there.
I won't.
I'm not.
You were there.
Yeah, this was. I mean, we're talking. This would have been 90 to 90, 92 to 96 roughly. But anyway, we also had some old school guys, like we had this guy named Doug Kellner, who was like a media studies guy, and if there was anybody who would have talked about Gadamer and then also Adorno and Horkheimer.
Adorno and Horkheimer. Yeah, I know Kellner.
Yeah. But he left and went to greener pastures, and it became this vicious infight between the people who were trying to hire more logicians to do modal logic and the people who wanted more Irrigaray.
Well, I just didn't know what to do with Gadamer because he talks so lovingly of British 18th century philosophers. I just don't know,
Which
anyone.
one? Can you say? Which ones?
He talks about when he talks about the notion of common sense and a community that comes to an understanding of taste. He cites oh gosh, I wish I had it with me, but Burke, some of the other 18th century people.
Okay, Burke, yeah, okay.
Oh gosh.
I know no one of value from England in the 18th century, so if someone finds someone, that's quite interesting.
He's not talking about the strict empiricist philosophers. He says there were like some of the people like Burke and Hume who talked about this feeling a community has about what is right and what is proper. And it was just very sort of waistcoaty, bewigged language. I didn't know who to talk to it about in 1992. It's not exactly
Maybe you talk about common sense. Maybe the Scottish moralist Thomas Reid. He had a theory.
Yes, and some of that's in there. He cites some of those as well. And that such an old way of looking at things. He said is it really what you call rigorous or what you call scientific epistemology. You're missing the concrete reality of the art experience. So to take non-rigorous or non-systematic thinkers seriously was challenge to a pretentious 24-year-old, but it very eye-opening and a wonderful book.
You were one of those, I see.
But as a book, it really opens your mind to all sorts of neglected corners of thinking that just, I guess, in a post-Enlightenment world are just not
yes,
sort of forgotten.
Yes, I mean that's one of my particular interests actually is reactions to the Enlightenment. I mean, and it does seem more and more that the way people react to the Enlightenment is there's a huge gap in it, right? And it does seem like Gadamer is part of that gap, of being sensibly continental, if I put it that way,
Yeah.
sensibly, groundedly observant, something like that. There does seem to be, maybe it's a cultural, political thing at the time, but there is a, extremity of views today, which is coming from the 80s of just lapsing into various kinds of relativism and people wanting to always codicil everything and prefix everything and make everything contingent and pay no attention to authority, to say that all authority can be dispensed with, or on the opposite side of things to say no, there's only my particular kind of authority, which is science or something like that. So, I would agree with you there that there is very great value to that kind of.
A lot of challenges to my prejudices. Every time I pick it up, it's a challenge to me.
Sorry, just to end on what it seems that when we were talking about Beethoven, that would seem very consistent in the notion of the power. I almost imagine Beethoven standing over Eric as he plays on the piano. The power of history weighing over you in terms of trying to you're almost as if when you're following in that tradition, right? I mean you're not speaking of yourself as the descendant of Beethoven, but you know what I mean in terms of trying to do some of the same things as he was doing. That seems.
I come out of Austrians. I'm a descendant of Richard Strauss and Andreas. A lot of waltzes. Happy waltzes. That's me.
But in the sense of you playing on the piano as being a powerfully historical activity to trying to grapple with these people, right? And So that's calling that subjective seems to me to be like calling that like woolly contingent subjective seems to be diminishing in some sense.
Yes, I think there is a. I don't know. I think people want to there's a mood of disrespect today, active or aggressive disrespect towards various kinds of authority. And some people some people when they hear it, they become very insecure about it, and some people when they hear it, they like it a lot. And it seems like there's a middle ground there of careful attention to what's going on. But there does seem to be, I don't know, from the little bits and pieces I've read of Gadamer, there does seem to be a neglect. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm a very, I know, great sympathy with Freud and things. There does seem to be a neglect of, I don't want to say libidinal economies and things like that, but a neglect of the sense of, there does seem to be an almost affected separation between the psychology of things and the psychology of things seems to be pushed all on the side of productive interpretation, right? That the psychology of stuff is just there in your productive interpretation. It doesn't seem to be there in the text. That's the impression I've got. I would be very suspicious of that myself. And I think that's what I was trying to get to with Beethoven, that example, that it just really is clear, it's strikingly obvious if you actually try and engage in any of this stuff, that there is, in the very structure of it, in the very heart of it, there is something inseparably psychological or driven, if you want to put it that way, about the thing itself. And whether you're an alien or a human being or a damaged human being or a superhuman being, that however you relate to it, that there is something in it that is not just authority in the sense in which I've only ever seen authority examples given.
Which, I mean, that's kind of what I was trying to get to with and I take your point about subject-object being slightly misleading, but talking about there's something that the text says and there's something that there's a way that you react to it. That's what I was trying to get to. And I do think that there is, I take your point about psychology. I think there's something to that.
I find it a little interesting that these guys who are so into figuring out language and meaning and grounding of things would be drawn toward poetry. I'm thinking of Georg Trakl, who was quite a drug addict, died very young, and Wittgenstein and Heidegger were kicking this kid money to keep him going. I don't know if you've ever read any of his poetry, but it's just absolutely almost hallucinogenic. And it's just such a contrast to just all of this hard reading of texts, and the poetry is I don't want to say opposite of that, because I'm sure there's an incredible structure to it, but
yeah, well, there's a scientific temperament to I'm going to use the word good, but good continental philosophy. There's a scientific temperament to it. If you look at any of the major works, you will find concerns about skepticism, about the heart of knowledge, and trying to address them, and trying to save particular kinds of activity by throwing away other kinds of activity. It's a game of how much can we save of the things we care about that's useful, and you get to extremes. But so I don't know. It seems like that when you read texts, like Heidegger's or Husserl's, for example, in particular, or Kant's, that really they're coming from a tradition which they haven't forgot about. They wake up thinking their problems are the problems of skepticism. It feels like the doubt is insisting upon them, and they have to address it some way, and they invent this whole machinery, and even retreat so far as saying everything's in consciousness to preserve the real hard structures of the things that they're interested in. And it's interesting that so often aligns with poetry and music and the rest of it, that it seems that if you take the project of skepticism, which seems so remote and bizarre in medieval times, and you trace it all the way through to people who actually still care about skepticism, so that's not really analytic people, but continental people who still care about trying to address all these problems, you eventually get to poetry and music and interpretive circularity and the rest of it. It's an interesting trajectory. And one you probably wouldn't expect, that a person like Kant to also be writing anthropology. apological texts, or smoking in the morning and drinking tea. I mean, it's a peculiar.
Well, I mean,
blend.
Sextus Empiricus was, he practiced surgery by day as best he could, and probably at night he drank some wine and read poetry. I mean, these things coexist nicely.
No, I know. I'm not. Yeah, sure. It's just interesting that the most hard line you get about the ability to be, if not epistemically certain, then ostensibly certain in the Heideggerian sense, that you can be ostensibly certain if you're disclosing in a particular way. That if you're doing that, then certainty is poetic almost. That it turns out that certainty isn't scientific. It turns out certainty is in the structure of poetry and language.
Well, and if Dylan were here, he would say, all these social scientists pining for the facts of hard science. Well, my God, when you get into subatomic physics and astrophysics, it all gets pretty poetic.
I was wondering if I could just take it back for a moment as far as is Gadamer saving like art and criticism from science in the sense that when he explicates that language is infinite, or in the sense that I was trying to get back to the fact that if we say there's an infinite meaning, that's fine. But if we hammer down on a meaning, if we say, Beethoven is great because he brings out this certain emotion, can science not swoop in at that point and say, oh, we can test for that emotion. We can make an experiment, say, does this certain activity make us, Beethoven's the best because he brings the feeling of war, and they can find a brain state when we think of war and test for that. Obviously, that's not compelling.
Like the McDonald's, like the food bliss point they've discovered between salt, sugar, and fat.
Yeah.
Yeah,
to some extent, we might be getting into the qualia question, right? And I'm not. I mean, because inevitably, when you talk about like measurement, talking about brain states and so on, there's all sorts of consciousness. There's a whole baggage of consciousness debate, which I'm not sure we want to get into. But
well, I mean, I think people like Gadamer, they use science in certain ways, and I don't know. I mean, they're not reacting to science; they're reacting to what I would call an Enlightenment mood, which very few scientists actually ever had. I mean, they had towards the end of the 19th century, but very quickly. I mean, if you look at Einstein, they started getting it again around Feynman, who I'm quite mad at for reintroducing it. But this sort of the Enlightenment mood, or the mood of positivism, you might call it positivism or something, but this sense of truth being indexed to scientific facts, that science is determinate of things of value, etc., etc., etc. None of that's inimical to science. None of that's scientific. It's just a particular way of relating to the world in general. It's a particularly limited way of saying, well, there's no real value to things and so on. So I think when Gadamer's trying to save things from that mood, which might be seen as like an explosion somewhere far off in the universe consuming everything, there's no real tension to science there. I mean, if you want to say that, my painting has a triangle on the surface of it, and that's why I painted it, then yes, a mathematician can come along and say, oh yes, there is a triangle there. There's no real tension between doing that. So, I mean, there's a lot of, there's occasional misconceptions about what people are actually hostile to, and it's never usually that science can be introduced at some point.
I guess I was saying, can we when we say a certain meaning, can we test that meaning scientifically, or when he brings in the infinite realm of language, does he simply state that it's impossible to test for a certain thing due to the infinity of meaning in a word? If we say that Beethoven is great because it brings out anger, then he would say, well, it's impossible just to say, what does anger mean? It's impossible
I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, I can't say with authority, but at the end of the day, people do stuff, right? I mean, people go into cars, they turn engines on, they drive to places, and all of this requires interpretation, meaning, and the rest of it. At the end of the day, you put things to use, and it seems like if you're going to say you can't, because of an infinity of interpretations, you can't put anything to use, then you've stumbled into a mess. I mean, I would highly doubt Gadamer say something as bizarre as that. I mean, I think he's just saying that the uses to which things can be put is many the plurality of ways of going about it, but you can fix on one and put it to use in a particular way. I mean, when he gives the example of law, I mean, that's one classic example of people doing that, really. I mean, law, the administration of law is science in this instance. You know, people are taking texts and they're just bashing on people's heads on the basis of it, or putting them in cells. There's not much difference between doing that and sticking a thermometer inside someone's ear and saying, well, are you angry on the basis of this?
But then you do, when you're talking about when we talk about people doing things, then you bring your own intention into it, don't you?
Yeah.
So interpretation and intention in this sense would be distinct.
Yeah. Well, you have to understand with respect to what? I mean, there's an intention in respect to applying something, and then there's your interpretation of it. But your interpretation is also intentional in a way. I mean, there's lots of different intentions going on.
Do you think it's about critical thinking skills then? Do you think critically about what you're talking about? This is what I meant by context.
Well, there's an intention to critically interpret, and there's an intention to use. Right? That's the distinction I think we're making.
That's one of them. I mean, it's best just put into moments, really, right? I mean, there's many moments before you put someone in a cage. There's the moment of reading the law. There's a moment of interpretation. There's a moment of reinterpreting on the basis of, someone's testimonies. There's another moment. There's another moment. Another moment, and each has its own intentions and contingencies and historical activities that are going on to it, and you can't just squish it all together. But at the end of the day, they are connected, and at the end of the day, someone is put inside a cage. So it seems like, however you want to cash it out, there is practice associated with interpretation, and necessarily so. And I mean, I can't speak to how Gadamer works it out all in detail, but it's certainly the case that it's possible. It must be for his examples to work.
Well, but then you get the question of can you know something about Beethoven's Fifth? I mean, quote unquote no, without knowing anything about classical music. You just show up and you're moved, and that sort of gets to one of the.
I think that's the dream of the Neoplatonists and one of the Theosophists. It's a dream of early modern art. I mean, I'm not convinced about.
Well, that was one of the themes in the podcast about you need to know a little to know a lot.
Oh, yeah, the Meno thing, yeah.
The Meno thing.
Yeah.
That Meno thing.
Yeah.
Oh, anyway,
All right. Well, let me do this. Let me make we'll call this a soft stop.
Yeah, I'm going to get a call from the airport soon.
Yeah.
So this might be a good time to.
I think I might call it up today. So.
Okay. Well, for the few and the intrepid that hung, first of all, thank you all for participating. Thank you for your patience while we worked out the technical details. I cannot recommend Google Hangouts tied to a Google Plus account as a way of doing this if you haven't already successfully done it. And thanks to Stephen for coordinating this, and I'm sorry he had a personal obligation they had to leave for, but it sounds like maybe the next live event we do should be somewhere in Canada based on attendance to this particular after show. So whoever wants to organize something in Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, or one of those places, please let us know.
I don't think even Canadians want to do that.
Yeah, terre de nos aïeux. Well, okay, so we don't have to sing the. That song was a very angry song at the podcast. Is that the one that had a lot of F-bombs at the end of the last podcast?
Well, like I mentioned, I haven't listened to it yet, so I'm not sure which song it was.
Okay. So we'll go off quietly.
Yes,
Right.
but if you want to sing something like the Canadian national anthem, feel free.
Good. Thank you so much. This was.
All right.
Bye then.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.